Say hello to Dan, who is just after landing back home. Are you exhausted, Dan? How tired are you right now?
I'm pretty exhausted, Ariel. I'll be honest. I mean, it's just gone 7 here, and yeah, I woke up in Dallas this morning, and I'm not quite sure if it's
Fuck.
the same day or if a week's passed. But I'll be fine after a night's sleep and a good meal.
Okay. Well, I appreciate you doing this under those conditions. Thank you very much.
Of
Also,
course.
what a weekend, by the way, for you. From San Antonio to Dallas. Did you drive to Dallas on Saturday or Friday night after the PFL event?
I drove in on Saturday morning. I actually landed in Dallas on Tuesday, picked up the car and drove to San Antonio.
What?
Did the event and then drove back on Saturday.
Wait, why did you do
Yeah.
that? Why didn't you fly to San Antonio?
I don't know. There's just something soul destroying about getting off a 9 hour flight and then getting on another one for another hour.
Okay.
I'd rather be in a car and kind of get out and stretch my legs and see a bit more of the place. I don't get to see too much if I'm flying, but if I'm driving, I get a better sense of the state and of the people and the landscape. I enjoy the process.
Okay, fair enough. How did you feel, the event went? I was talking about before you came on. I thought it was fun. Sometimes it's okay to have fun. The crowd was insane. It felt like a UFC event. It felt combustible. It was packed from, the prelims on. But from your perspective, and you were locked in for the vast majority of it, I was kind of milling around. How did you think the event was and the experience?
I thought it was awesome. I'll be honest. I mean, it was sports entertainment at its
Mm.
best. I remember being at the Maymac fight and the atmosphere around that as well. And I mean, unfortunately, I missed the build up, and you were of course leading the whole fight week, and it looked like a really really good time out there. But when I arrived on Saturday at the hotel, straight away there were just people everywhere. So many 209 t-shirts, it was ridiculous, and the atmosphere was great. The walkouts were good. And the other thing I really liked as well is that the boxing people that were there, the Sean Porters and Alicia, they were just so surprised that there were people there from the first fight on the card.
Isn't that crazy?
It was like what? Why are there fans in the building? The MMA crowd really showed up, and I think everybody had a good night. It was a really entertaining show. We had great fights. Serrano was wild against Heather Hardy. I enjoyed the whole thing.
Did Nate surprise you?
I suppose he did, but not necessarily in the best kind of way.
Okay.
I was expecting him to look a little bit more stable on his feet, and there were times when I felt like he was lunging into range a little bit. He made it easy for Jake to hit him sometimes, which I was expecting him to be a bit slicker with his defense in boxing. But it was a good scrap, and I'd love to see him run it back in MMA. I mean, that's ultimately what we want to see. That for me was the appetizer, and it seemed like Nate was kind of accepting of that anyway. He was stoking the fire by saying, it doesn't really matter what happens. He can't beat me in a fight. And, Chris has just, reinstated that there as well. I feel like it sets the stage really well for an MMA fight. And we've got to remember Jake Paul, he was a strong wrestler. I think it would be an interesting fight.
Okay, so then on the flip side, just from a boxing perspective, did Jake surprise you at all?
Yeah, he did. Absolutely. A few things surprised me about him. I mean, I thought, of course, he'd put the time and the work in, to pick up the skills that he needed to beat Nate. Like specifically, he'd been trained to capitalize on the mistakes that Nate was making. Like when Nate was lunging in with his left hand, we were seeing that check right hook the check left hook from Jake Paul over and over again. And it was just able to knock him off balance because of the way that Nate opens himself up as he throws. So that was clearly something that they game planned, something that they knew and they timed and worked. Also, the uppercuts on the inside, I thought he did a very good job with them. There were some times when he kind of got pushed around a bit by Nate, but of course, Nate's going to get to you at some point in a fight like that. The times when Jake impressed me was when he came out of his corner. You could tell he'd listened to his corner team, and he started to create some space. And he was letting Nate move into range and picking him off as he was moving in. I thought he showed a lot of maturity, honestly, and I was impressed.
It's a crazy thing because we were talking about this earlier about like the lack of love that Jake gets, or the lack of the willingness to not give him any respect or love. And sometimes I like to hit mitts after 30 seconds. Dan, I'm exhausted, and this young man has 8 fights on his pro record, 1 amateur fight, and he's going 10 rounds. That alone, even if he's going 10 rounds against like a dummy, that's exhausting in its own right in front of 20,000 people. And so that alone to me is impressive. To go in there against a dog like Nate, who has been there, who doesn't go away, who's a zombie, that's impressive too. Was he the more crisp boxer, technical? Sure. But like those things in its own right to me are enough to say, you know, respect, well done. Do you feel the same way? Less like even Sean, I could tell, Sean Porter, like he doesn't quite, as the boxing guy, doesn't want to quite give him the love and respect. And I'm like, what's the problem? Who at 7-1, 6-1 is doing this in boxing? No one is.
Yeah, I mean, most people are fighting on undercards of undercards, fighting someone who's, 4-26. Like, you've got to respect what he's doing and the risk that he's taking, but also he's showing people that you can put yourself out there, you can leave yourself vulnerable to take these big risks, and it doesn't matter if you pick up a loss. I think the message that he's putting across is actually quite a powerful one, not only about looking after fighters, the fighter pay, and making sure people are getting what they're worth, but also like the encouragement that he gives people in his post-fight speech about believing in yourself and trying. He's clearly a very driven individual, what he's created for himself. And just to mention it as well, Logan Paul, he did WWE and then flew straight in to see his brother.
Crazy.
I mean, like two guys that are just absolutely smashing it out the park right now. And that was a real fight. Nate was there to beat him. If Nate could have put him away, he would have done. And I think Jake did a very good job of showing a very improved boxing skill set. He's taking big risks that other people aren't, and he's bringing a lot of eyes to the sport. I have nothing but respect for him, and I'm prepared to see him develop and pick up some more losses. And I don't really mind either way because, it's a different thing to pro boxing where everyone's trying to keep that undefeated.
So why do you think people don't want to give him that respect and love?
I think I can't remember who it was that stated it in the DAZN documentary that I watched, but it was I think it's because he didn't go the regular route. He
Mm.
didn't do the hard amateur rounds and the years in the boxing gym and, climbing his way up through the undercards. He kind of arrived on the scene with a big following and was able to command a space that nobody else could command that's just come through the regular boxing route. But ultimately, these boxers can learn something from Jake Paul. He's a very smart, marketable individual. And, the most important thing is that he allows people in on his journey, right? People want to live vicariously through other people. They want to be connected to people's journeys, and he makes that very accessible for people. And most boxers don't do that. The one thing we learned about combat sports generally across the board is that people will be far more invested if they know the fighters,
Hmm.
right? I used to go and watch Nottingham Panthers, and when one of those guys was fighting on the ice, it was like my brother was fighting because I watched them every week because I was engaged in their story, right? Like if a fighter just shows up 3 times a year and has a good fight and then disappears, it's not necessarily enough these days with all the noise in social media. You've got to kind of make yourself more available on a regular basis for the fans to connect with you and see your journey. And also, again, see some vulnerability, see you pick yourself up and brush yourself off and go again, take another big risk.
Jake's feud with MMA has lasted about 2.5 years now, amazingly. Do you feel like it should come to an end now? Like if you were advising him, is it time to pivot? Or to your point earlier, a lot of those fans were MMA fans. All the MMA media was there. Is there something to be said for like, hey, let's just keep this going until no one is paying attention?
I don't know. I don't know necessarily as he has a feud with MMA. I think he's just picking very, very specific opponents in a very clever way. And it's much easier to entice a big name from mixed martial arts into a boxing ring because he knows MMA fighters will take risks. He also knows that we're cutting off, 80% of our skill set to step into the ring. So we have this undeniable kind of get out clause of, well, I catch you in a guillotine at the end of the fight, and that would have been the end. Like there's always the get out of, yes, but in a real fight, I would beat you up. So he's very, very clever at bringing people over at certain times. I mean, you look at the guys that he's fought. Like he beat Anderson Silva, right? But he was 47 and he
Mm.
was Anderson Silva that had aged considerably. And, the things that made Anderson Silva great were a lot like what made Roy Jones great, and those skills deteriorate very quickly with age. He knows how to pick these guys off. Like Tyron Woodley just doesn't like fighting. He hasn't done for years. Ben Askren could never box. It's, no matter what sport he was in. He's being very specific. Now, I had a few people message me and say, well, who do we put in from mixed martial arts to like represent us?
Right.
And I don't know. I don't necessarily like they're representing themselves. It's a different thing entirely. It's entertainment, sports entertainment, however you want to say it. And I think he's doing a very good job of bringing the right people in with the right following and excitement around them, the respect that they can fight as well. And he's having a lot of fun, beating them at boxing.
Okay, but do you want to like if you were in charge, would you like to see him fight another MMA guy? Let's say a Platinum Perry, someone who's because obviously like we could name it, we could say someone from the UFC, but the UFC is not letting someone just walk over there to fight Jake Paul. So we have to be realistic. Maybe a Michael Venom Page type of guy. Don't know if he's big enough. I don't know. Correct me if I'm wrong. Maybe if they do it in the UK, or do you want him to just fight regular boxers at this point? Are you one of the people who are saying like just go fight someone who's 8-0, 9-0?
No, I would rather see him fight people that I know, people that
Mm.
have got a pedigree in mixed martial arts or something else. I mean, we could bring somebody over from kickboxing. There's a lot of good fighters that I don't know what weight Tyrone Spong is, but he's an
Oh
example of
my,
kind of an outlier,
yeah.
someone that is, but MVP, that was the name that came to my mind. That would be an incredible fight. MVP's had a couple of boxing matches, and Mike Perry would be a fun one. But if you're digging into the UFC archive, it's got to be someone like a Robbie Lawler or a Matt Brown would be an absolute scrap as well. But they're the kind of people that he's going to want to pick off. Um, but I know he keeps throwing the name Canelo around, and one thing we have to realize is the vast gap between where Jake Paul is currently and where Canelo is. So in between the time where he starts fighting professional boxers and now, I don't mind seeing him work his way through some more MMA fighters and put some money in their pockets because he might be the first person ever to do it, right?
Yeah.
Like pay some of these guys.
He's become like the MMA fighter pension plan in a weird way, or retirement plan. Who would have thought? It's a crazy thing. Um, why are you interested in the MMA fight between these two guys, Diaz and Paul?
Because honestly, and I know I'm going to get some heat for this, but I think it could be competitive.
Wow.
I think what we've seen from Jake Paul in a boxing match is that he's willing to stand and trade with Nate at times. He's willing to be in the pocket. He's got good boxing from the outside as Nate's moving into range, and Nate's boxing never looked any better in mixed martial arts than it did then on the night. So you've got to think that in a striking sense, there's going to be some kind of level of competitiveness because Nate was never really a kicker either. And the other thing as well, right? Jake Paul's surrounded himself with people that can coach him in the right ways. He would invest money in himself, as he will in Amanda Serrano, to make the crossover and make it right. Like he can afford whatever he wants, so he's going to make sure that he's well prepared. And Nate, at this stage of his career, again, I was surprised he didn't cut more than he did. There was just a tiny bit of blood over one of his eyes. But you bring knees and kicks into it. You've got Jake, who's a strong wrestler. It, Most likely Nate would submit him, of course,
Mhm.
most likely. But I can't count Jake out to in being competitive in that fight, especially because Nate's nearly 40 and we do slow down and he's got a lot of wear and tear on him. He's not the same Nate that he used to be, of course.
What do you make of Nate's ability, much like the Leon fight, to let's say lose 3/4 of the fight, if not more, but then have a great moment and everyone just runs with that and he runs with that and everyone's like, yeah, he would have really won if it was a real, but like he just has this ability to have one great moment and he's then deemed the people's winner. I don't recall a lot of people being able to do that in the history of MMA and the history of fight sports.
No, no. I mean, it's a very unique quality that he's got, and I admire it. I mean, he's almost untouchable in that sense. He always seems to win the moral victory no matter
Yes.
what, and I love it because yeah, he is untouchable. Why not take a $10 million risk and fight him in mixed martial arts? So what? It doesn't matter at this stage with Nate. He's a cool icon, same as Nick Diaz is, of course, but it's almost like Nate arrived in a different era, and he's capitalized on this era very well, and I think that it doesn't really matter what he does. He'll always be legendary. Same as Chuck Liddell, when he
Right.
retired, it didn't matter that he had a rough streak. Everyone's going to love him forever.
I feel like he's going to go back to the UFC and fight someone like Dustin Poirier or even Conor McGregor. Would you be surprised if that happens?
I honestly won't be surprised if the UFC tried to get him back to do the McGregor trilogy. That wouldn't surprise me at all. And then that would potentially set up the number one contender for the BMF belt. That would make a lot of sense. But who knows? I mean, Nate's a man of his own mind. He's been talking about a co-promotion, so he might want to start thinking about laying some foundations for what he's going to do after he retires. He's got a lot of guys in his gym that he wants to keep active.
So do you think that it would be like after everything it took for him to get out of the UFC, one fight and then come back, would that feel like a letdown or would you understand why?
No, I get it. I get it. It's the UFC. I mean, who
Yeah.
doesn't love the UFC? We're all fans of it because it's the pinnacle of mixed martial arts, and that's where he's going to get the most love and the most recognition, given the fact that that's where he's always been. But at the same time, I feel like it more suits his character to not go back.
Mhm.
You know, I mean, if he does, it's going to be for a lot more money. But I still don't know as he'd make enough in the UFC to, comparably. If it is about the money, if it's about us making as much as he can right now. But he mentioned the UFC to you a couple of times, didn't he, last week?
Yeah.
He said, "Oh, I might go back." It's right now it's the biggest platform in mixed martial arts, and I'm not saying that the PFL pay-per-view is not going to take over. I would certainly like it to rise to that level of the UFC and the PFL generally. Of course, I am a little biased now, but um, I get it. I'm a huge UFC fan. I loved my time with the UFC. I love commentating for the UFC, and I think that fighting in the octagon is a privilege that everybody should appreciate, and I think Nate does just as much as anyone.
Afterwards, we had the privilege of speaking to Nick Diaz. Were you as surprised as I was about what he said? I was not expecting him to be so critical of the fight because his brother was involved, and then to like Todd asked him a question, and he's like, "Let's just cut to the chase. I want in," and I was not expecting all of that. Were you feeling the same?
Yeah, I was a little surprised. I was a little surprised. I don't really know what to make of it all, to be honest. I mean, Nick's always been a bit of an enigma, hasn't he?
Right.
Like I remember there was one time we were at a UFC event and he didn't say anything to me. He just flexed and then walked off. It's like he's just I love the guy. I'm a big fan. The Dosbrack painting of Nick and Nate, the Diaz
Yes.
army. I bought that. I have a copy of that.
Wow.
I'm a big fan of the Diaz brothers, and I think Nate's fascinating. I wonder what motivates him right now, and I don't know whether it's money. I don't know whether it's because he kind of fell out of the limelight a little bit before the limelight got so bright.
Mm.
I'm sure he pictures himself in these big fights and wants these moments. Like Nick Diaz against Gomi for us as MMA fans was absolutely huge. But it seems like years, I mean, it was years ago now, but it seems like so long ago in MMA history that most people won't ever look at Nick Diaz and think that the first time. They'll see Nate and they'll go, I'm not surprised and
Hmm.
beating Connor. That's the first thing that will come to mind when they see the Diaz brothers. And I'm sure Nate wants the respect. I mean, he said it, didn't he? That, remember I'm the OG.
Hmm.
Like it was like kind of reestablishing himself as, don't forget who kind of started this whole Stockton chaos.
No one could have ever predicted when we first were introduced to Nate that he would be 10 times more popular, right? He obviously had the longevity here on the back end during this explosion of MMA, but like Nick was, at one point top 5 best fighters in the world, most beloved fighters in the world, and so it's just been crazy to see the reversal of roles. Last time I spoke to you, it was just when you announced that you were going to head up the PFL Europe operations. How has it gone? 2 shows in the books. Like I said, you were in San Antonio on Friday for a regular PFL playoff event. I'll ask you about that in a moment. But the role working with PFL Europe in particular, how has it gone so far?
Yeah, I'm loving it. I mean, the Newcastle one was kind of I showed up quite late because obviously Veronica was fighting, so I
Right.
I, I pretty much joined the company 2 weeks before and came into that as a commentator. The Berlin card I was far more involved in, but still, the global team did a fantastic job selecting those fighters, and I think we had some really good performances. Of course, there are standouts, the likes of Lewis McGrillen. Is just he's spectacular 2 times in there and 2 big knockouts. I'm excited to see where he goes, and he'll be on the Dublin card at the end of the year. Um, the Paris card is looking very very good. We've got some more stuff to announce about it, which I'm excited about, but that'll be later this week.
Okay.
But yeah, big things happening, very very exciting, and the, just thinking forward to 2024 and looking at the rosters that I'm putting together, like I'm building the rosters for next year, who I want on the shows and what weight classes, and there's some real talent across Europe, and talent that's just kind of sitting in gyms waiting to get some action. There's just not enough shows around at the moment, and I'm trying to find guys that are well established amateurs that are ready to cross over and make a big run. And there's an abundance of them in Europe.
Finally going to get to see Cedric Doumbé in Paris, right? We've been waiting for
Yeah.
this. I can't wait.
Yeah, very, very excited to see him. I mean, of course, he's had 4 MMA fights, but he's known as a kickboxer, and he's still going through that phase of adapting his striking to MMA. But I interviewed him a couple of weeks ago, and he's just supremely confident in his capabilities. I love it. Just the swagger that he's got and everything he speaks about himself. It's like I look at all these guys on the roster. Sadabusi, yeah, he's good, but I just know I'm better, and that kind of confidence goes a long way. It sells a lot of tickets as well. I tell you that. There's going to be a real atmosphere in there on the night.
How was Friday's show? Obviously, Jesus Pineda had a nice showing. What a story! He's kind of been like one of the stories of the year, I would say, right?
It's been incredible. I mean, you just look at that journey for both of those. Him and Braga, they fought together to a split decision. Braga picked it up, but Pinedo was coming on really strong at the end of that fight. So you kind of think, well, if you had two more rounds, would it look different? And then they both went their separate ways. Braga gets Moraes and Pineda gets Brendan, obviously the former champion. And, you know, definitely the harder fight out of the two at this stage in the career, and looked, more impressive, if anything. He was like, Braga looked very sharp and very clinical, but Pinedo's a monster. He's a huge, powerful fighter that has got a lot of confidence and a lot. I mean, he fights with a real chip on his shoulder. Fights like he's fighting the world, and you can feel that when he's in there. He's got a rage inside him that comes out when he's competing. And both of the guys, they had great performances. Chris Wade being an incredibly tough test for Braga, but Pinedo just manhandled Bubba Jenkins. Nobody saw that coming. I expected it to be a very back and forth fight, but I also expected Bubba Jenkins to put him in some spots where he'd be troubled. But we just didn't see it. He was dominant. He was lethal. And to think of those two guys now going back into a rematch over 5 rounds for the championship, like it's almost like a new wave of stars has been born in this season.
By the way, have you seen that meme of you and Kenny after Pineda beat Brendan Loughnane and Kenny's going crazy and you are just stone faced? Have you seen this?
I was completely in shock.
I think we
I was
have it right here.
expecting
I
it
don't know
to.
if you can see it, but like you are just emotionally. He's going. Look at you. What is going on? You're not moving.
I was honestly, I was completely in shock. And the other thing as well is it was such a weird angle because we were behind Brendan. So I heard like a cracking, snapping sound. And I was like, I was looking at the monitors to see what I could see where Brendan was damaged, because I wasn't sure whether it was a body kick or whether he took a knee to the head, or it was a very, very fast finish, and he read it perfectly. I actually did a breakdown that didn't get played on the air, but it was about Brendan level changing into that center line, and you could see Pinedo's team had done their research and picked up on that trait and worked it perfectly. I mean, I just think the sky's the limit for him at the moment, and excited to see him back in there.
Last thing, we keep seeing the MMA guys lose in the squared circle. Will Francis change that trend on October 28th?
I love him for taking on such a challenge, but like Tyson Fury might be the best heavyweight boxer that's ever lived. I mean, like it seems weird saying that given the fact some of the fighters that have been in the past, but the way that he moves for a big man and the skills that he's got, and he's wily, but he's huge and he can take a hell of a punch, as we know. It's going to be very interesting to see what Francis Ngannou can add to his game, especially with Mike Tyson working with him. I'm hoping that Mike Tyson's going to work some of that peekaboo style, and he's also going to encourage him to work the body a little bit, because the drawback of a power puncher is that they tend to hunt for the head. And Tyson Fury's tall and he's very, very good slipping away and countering with uppercuts. It's going to be an incredibly tough test for Ngannou. But you can't say the man's afraid of taking risks, because this is probably the biggest risk you take in boxing right now.
Can't wait for that. Can't wait for his PFL debut next week. Most importantly, can't wait for Nottingham Forest against Arsenal this weekend. First game of the season. Where's Veronica watching?
We'll be watching at home, I
All
think. We'll
right.
be watching at home.
I feel like she's made you into a fan again. She has brought you back. Is that accurate?
That is accurate.
I
Yeah,
love it.
absolutely. Just that I used to follow Forest all the time along with my dad. I used to have posters of Stuart Pearce on my walls back in the day, Nigel Clough, the old guys. But I kind of fell out of love with it when they started falling over and rolling around on the ground. And it was like I like the days of like Stuart Pearce and Vinnie Jones, where it was borderline fighting on the pitch. Roy Keane, those
Yeah,
kind of guys. But I don't know. They're a little bit more flimsy now, aren't they? And a little bit more spoiled. So I like to see people dig in and fight for the ball. So it's far more tactical, and I have to appreciate that about mixed martial arts as well.
sure.
It's that like modern day professional sports is like the Floyd Mayweather of fighting. It's you have to appreciate the tactical and finesse of it. And I'm still a bit more. Get stuck in with some elbows and get the ball off them as quickly as possible.
Well, you better jump fully on board because some magic is about to happen this season, and she's going to bring you along for the ride. And I will try my best as well. But it's great to see how into it she is. It was so great to work with you. Honestly, it was the highlight of my night. Being there, calling that fight with you was so much fun. So again, thank you for being so kind. Tremendous job all weekend, Friday and Saturday, and I hope you get some rest. Thanks for doing this after a long journey home, Dan.
Thank you, my friend. It's always a pleasure to talk to you, and it was great working with you as well. I hope we get to see you in more of those situations, working those events.
Appreciate it very much. Thank you, Dan. Talk to you soon. There he is, Dan Hardy.